right? And be able to answer the question. So I guess a better way to say it is more memorized. So 8, 9, and 10. 10 especially, because we went over that after the quiz, right? So 10 is a... There's 2 answers. Anybody want to tell me what the 2 answers are? Close. 50%, right? So the 2 answers are, for number 8, the 2 answers are C and E. Right? And that only has 2 possible anhydride bonds, right? Because one of them is connected to the carbon. Right? Yes. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a good question. Where is that? Where is that? C, D? No, C. C. Sugar moiety. That just means the sugar piece. Right? So remember, glycosidic linkage, right, is sugar and something else, right? And so the sugar we call the sugar moiety. That piece. Yeah, so that's a good point, right? Try not to let one word throw you off, right? So just if you don't know what the word means and you can't figure out the context, just skip the word. The sugar is linked. There you go, right? Right? And so moiety is just another word for piece, right? It's just a really fancy way of saying that. Adenosine, nitrogenous base is adenosine, and right, with the sugar, and then the active form, yes, is in, this is wrong because it's adenosine when it's with the sugar, right? It's adenine when it's by himself, adenosine with the sugar. I stress that a lot, and now I'm doing a problem on that, so what do you guys think? Yes, I told you guys, I'm so transparent. I feel like I give it all away, right? And so not only did I stress that twice when I did the review and this, right? So that's an important piece of the puzzle. And then we know, we talk about it's complex with magnesium. Do you have a question? So the nitrogenous base is adenine. The nitrogenous base with ribose is adenosine. Does that make sense? All right, let's see, number 8. What do we think the answers are? I'll give you guys a minute, since you probably didn't read it. 9, pardon me, yes, 9. Did we just do 8? I also went over this twice, now that I think about it. So this is one of those where you really just have to read it. Anybody want to guess? And except for the people who I told was the right answer, anybody want to guess what the answer is? A. Yes, indeed. Great, that one's obvious, right? Remember we talked about it, you got Dr. Harton, he's hammered it into you, resonance, right? Resonance is the way. Increase the electrostatic repulsion upon hydrolysis? No. Right? It increases, so then you should say, how could this be true? Increase of electrostatic repulsion before hydrolysis, right? That's how that would be true. Interaction between the terminal phosphoryl group with the ribose group of ADP. What? You know what that is? That's cyclic AMP. So that's just making anyone think that, oh, I know what cyclic AMP is, that's what that tractor is doing. Formation of a salt bridge, I'm done, right? Right? All right, number 10. We know this one should roll off our tongues. This is a quick, easy memorizing. We covered this. This was on the quiz. Yes. Wait, before I answer this one. What is this one? Preaching phosphate, 1,3-BPG, and Petra's not there, right? So just those 2 guys. What is your question on 9? Repulsion? Yes, but the thing is, it's saying when you have hydrolysis of ATP, so that's saying ADP and inorganic phosphate have more electrostatic repulsion than ATP. So if it said before hydrolysis, if that word upon was before, that's true. Yes. Upon basically means after. Yeah. All right, so let's do 11. I actually have it from the textbook. The question is asked in the student companion in the textbook, but tell you guys? Probably important, right? So we'll do the student companion one. Alright, so anybody wanna just offer a reason why ATP is in the middle of the list and it's advantageous that's in the middle of the list? You wanna go, Carol?
The negative G for the other compounds are too high, so they wouldn't reverse, whereas ATP can donate and
Exactly. Yeah.
reverse.
ATP is like the histidine phosphoryl donor, right? And so, and then also another reason I would have accepted is that the reactions in our bodies, we don't need that much energy, right? So and so if that's what you were thinking, you were correct, right? And so, if it was a multiple choice exam, one or the other would be good, right? All right, let's see if we can do another one. I want to do 13. There's multiple right answers on this one. All right, 13. I heard an A. You guys like A? So it says, which of the following statements, oh no, that's the wrong one. Which of the following features of the part of the ATP-ADP cycle, A, ATP hydrolysis is used to drive reactions. Yeah, duh, right? A is good. Let's see, what do you guys think the other one is? E, a transmembrane proton gradient can drive ATP synthesis? Yes, right? We talked about how everybody's hanging out outside of mitochondria, ATP translocase is hanging out in there. So E is good. And then those are the only right answers. So let's see, C, oxidation of fuel molecules forms ATP from ADP plus inorganic phosphate. Huh. I can see why you would pick C. I don't like the way it's worded. I feel like, because I think the reason why it's incorrect is because it says fuel molecules, and so if it said oxidation of NADH, right, like a coenzyme. So I don't get into those semantics, right, like so that one wouldn't even be an answer choice, but I believe that's why, and so I could see why you would be swayed to answer C. All right, so for A, the question, for 12, the question says incorrect. But it turns out that, or the original question said correct, so it turns out 4 of the 5 are correct. So I just changed it to incorrect. And so let's see if we can do that and just find the thing that's wrong. I don't know why they chose that. Okay. Yeah.
You're using version, the 908 version?
I'm almost positive we're using version 8. I'm like 95% sure. Because I never really had a hard copy of 9, so All right, so I gave you the cheat, right? So now we could probably figure it out better, right? This comes from this table right here that we briefly discussed at the end of Friday and then beginning of lecture Monday, right? So now which one is wrong? C, right? Because once I give you the chart, it's completely obvious, right? I told you there's only one answer. So let's go why each one's right. ATP of the muscle can sustain contraction for less than a second. Yep, that's true. Creatine phosphate serves as a phosphoryl reservoir that replenishes the AT pool, right? Yep, that's true, right? That's what his role is. Creatine phosphate support up to 4 minutes. Nope, right? Only a minute, right? Phosphoguanidino group of creatine phosphate. So remember we talked about this in the last one, right? We have arginine has a guanidino group, and that's actually where creatine's guanidino group comes from, right? So that's what they were talking about there. Again, you didn't remember that, there's no reason why you can get the question wrong, right? You're like, phosphoguanidino group, I feel like I heard of guanidino, I don't know, and then like, you know, instead of freaking yourself out, say, it must be the functional group that is on the molecule. Let me answer the question as if it is, right? So we'll say the functional group that's on this molecule, has a large negative C standard free energy for hydrolysis, yeah, right? And then creatine phosphate is formed by a reaction between creatine and ATP, yes, right? We actually hammered that out in the quiz. So again, for D, if you don't remember that, there's no reason why you can't get it wrong. Like, I'm not gonna put the carboxylic acid group on creatine. I'm not gonna get that into the weeds in the memorizing part, right? This is more application based. So trust yourself, just say, okay, the functional group. All right, let's see. What is the next one I pulled? The rest of them are pretty memorizey. So I wanted to do, let's do number 6, but I want you to see that number 9 we already covered. So like I said, if it's in both the textbook and the student companion, it's probably a student learning outcome that is pretty important. So we'll just do number 6. This is the textbook, page 446, version 8 of the textbook, I believe. So in the version 9, it'll be somewhere around that page. So this one's a pretty straightforward, right? There was a question on your last exam that had 2,3-DPG, what attracts it to hemoglobin, and it was just a positive, negative thing, right? So this is a reoccurring theme. In the first exam, we had a question about a lysine and who would he like to be next to, and it was a glutamic acid, I believe, was the question, or aspartic acid. So this is a reoccurring theme, right? Plus, likes, minuses, plus, likes, minuses. And so it's basically saying ATP is bound to magnesium. So you're like, okay, magnesium is a plus. So why is this the case? Because ATP has a lot of negatives, right? So very straightforward, right? And so these are, like, again, these are the ones that I feel like we've hammered in, and we should get these pretty quickly. All right, so 12, I just want to point out, right? So I copied and pasted 12, and I used it on your quiz, right? And the reason why I'm showing you guys that is because when you're studying for the quiz, you can go ahead and go into the student companion or the textbook and say, well, these are probably the questions that she's going to copy and paste for the quiz. I literally copied and pasted this, right? You can see it's almost exactly all I said right here. Instead of using the data, table 13.1, I said, reverse or color, right? So you can even see it's even in the same, right, format. So I just wanted to point that out to you guys. All right, so now let's up the ante. And this one, I would score as a level 5 question, right? So it means you have to do application. So let's see if we can up the ante and do something that provides a little bit more of the noggin. Oh, I think I got quiet.
The litter box is in the closet. that little bitch, she like will in the closet or does she like what's her name? What's it called? She would play, like last night I sat with her till 3 a.m. and she was like playing in her litter box and then the moment I fell asleep she peed on my bed. I was like, yes.
Anyone wanna take a stab at it? Anyone wanna explain this effect to me? Yeah, go for it. Uh-huh.
To make the delta G a smaller negative value, so that's
Yeah. And so that's what it's saying, and so why?
that happens because the MG2 plus stabilizes the ATP and the ATP format, thus likely to end up with ADP.
Correct. Correct. Awesome. Awesome. All right. So I'm sure there's some of you guys that were like, I don't even know. Right? Because one thing that drives me nuts, especially when I look at the exams, this happened a couple of times, when somebody's like, oh, I didn't even answer that. I didn't know. No. Remember I said that the other day? No. Never do that. If I'm in class and there's a question and you don't know it, what do? You make an appointment with me on a Thursday, or you come to the review session on a Wednesday, or you say, I can't come on either one of those days, and then I'll meet you on a Tuesday, right? So this is one of those things. So the first thing we're gonna do, and here, so sit this way, that way I can scan it in, right? So I wrote it out, because, right, so I can scan it in for you guys. All right, so I just made a rough version of the chart. So whenever you have a chart, the first thing you do is say, what am I looking at here, right? So what are the axes? This axis is negative delta G. That's going from 30 to 36. So this is really minus 30 to minus 36. So as we're going up the axis, is it gonna be more or less spontaneous? So we're gonna say more spontaneous, right? So you could just write this next to the question on your exam, if you have one like this, right? All right, so this one says PMG, right? And the question says, right, it reminds you, PMG equals negative log mg, right? That makes sense, right? Right? PKA equals negative log Ka. PH equals negative log H. So what do we know? So then automatically you should say, okay, PMG, oh my God, that's so weird. No, right? I know the pH scale, right? We did so many things with pH scale. And so whenever we have the pH scale, we always had, right? We always have pH here, right? And we have 1 to 7. So we know this is 10 to the minus 1, 10 to the minus 7, right? We understand our pH scale. So and this axis, are we getting more magnesium or less magnesium? Less. Right? Because this is 7, right? And this is, right, that, right? Right, just like when pH is big, it's less proton, right? So when this number is big, it's less magnesium, right? Okay, so now I have it, now I can answer any question because I already know. Less magnesium, more spontaneous. Okay, what does magnesium do? We just covered that in the easy question. What does magnesium do? It provides the positive next to the negative. And then the word is, right, that he used the right word. If he didn't use the right word, right, I would have just kept asking until someone did. And what is that right word? You guys know, because I always ask. Yes, exactly. It's all about who's more stable, right? And so the conclusion you can come to, and again, there's many different ways that it could be phrased. The more magnesium, the more stable, less delta G. The less magnesium, the less stable, the more spontaneous reaction is. There is a direct correlation between the stability and delta G, right? We know that. We talked about that. We discussed that, right, in many different ways, shapes, and forms, right? So that's the key, right? And that word stable keeps coming up, right? So you should have a profound understanding what stability means and how to identify things that are more stable than others. Right, and so that's basically what we need to get ourselves to doing. Does anyone have any questions about this one? Okay, I got a bunch. I'll do this side first. So the more negative, the more unstable the molecule is, right? Because more delta G will come off, right? And so essentially what this is saying, we have ATP, and we know it's always coupled to its partner, magnesium, right? And ADP, magnesium, right, plus inorganic phosphate, that is minus 30, that's what we learned, right? But if we have ATP with no magnesium, turns out that that is minus 36, right? And the ones that have the higher negative, like PEP, are the ones that the phosphate wants to go much more. Phosphate's much more uncomfortable. So that's what this is saying. Does that make more sense? All right, and then there were questions on this side, unless I answered them.
You answered.
Okay, all right. So, I'm not gonna lie, you expect to see this on your exam. Why would I spend all this time on it, right? I'm not gonna lie to you guys. That's why also I made it so it would be scannable. All right, we're gonna do one more. This is also a higher level thinking question. It is on page 467 in version 8 of the textbook. Version 8, I believe. This is version 8 of the textbook. And, this is the only one I have at home, so that's usually what I make my copies on. And it's this number, 18. I will give you guys a hint, I just gave this answer away. I literally just gave it away. And I'll give you another hint, guanidino. Right, I just gave it away. On purpose. And then I wanted to wait a little bit to see if it can come back. So anybody new want to offer a reason? Miss Casey? Does it make creatine phosphate or does it? Yeah, so it makes creatine phosphate, but in this case, is it making creatine phosphate or is it mimicking creatine phosphate, right? Is it substituting? Awesome, yeah, exactly. So we got it. We got it, right? So, teamwork makes the dream work, right? We got it together. So, this right here, and I gave it away, right? Because I showed you guys creatine phosphate, right? That's our prime creatine phosphate. And then I also gave it away by reminding you guys that the guanidino on arginine is what actually is the same guanidino on creatine phosphate. And then creatine phosphate has a phosphate group on that guanidino, right? And so it's, right, we got the double bond off, our lone pair off, double bond off, right? And so we have this conjugation, pi electrons right here, phosphate group, super duper unhappy, wants to bounce, right? And so it turns out that if you put a phosphate group right here, that's what that is, arginine phosphate. I think there was even a picture of him right there. You have phosphate group right there, act the same way, right? So I believe that your answer might have allowed you to find the right answer in the multiple choice. But again, the answer that was given, the second answer, that is actually what the answer on the multiple choice will say, right? That it mimics creatine phosphate. It will say something along those lines, right? So, okay, these are ones, remember we did one of these in the last class, these are the ones that we're terrible at, so let's see. Okay, let's see, we'll do this one first, right? We're terrible at this. Who is this? Somebody help me. This is the active site of who? Exokinase, thank you, right? Okay, let's see, let's ask a couple of questions. What types of amino acids are likely where A is? So I give you choices so that we don't have to, so. Aspartic acid, is there positive charges on the bottom part of the pyranose ring of glucose? No. All right, let's guess again. S? Yeah. right? Because chymotrypsin has an S, and what fits there? Phenylalanine, right? So why not? And then also L. S is more likely because L is kind of big, right? So I think S would be the best guess, right? Does that make sense? Yeah.
What is A supposed to?
A is just a letter. So the question, A is that hydrophobic pocket that, right? So I just gave it away, right? X is the hydrophobic pocket that attracts the Peyronie's ring of glucose in the active site, right? So that's the specificity pocket. We monkey with that. KM changes. That's where glucokinase has a little bit of differences in there, right? Yes.
Were you asking like what could be in the place of?
Yes. Or what is the, like, I think the question would probably be phrased, which amino acid would likely to be where letter A is, or somewhere organized like that, right? We had a similar question on exam 2 where it was CPA's active site. And it was like, which of the following is likely to be in letter D, or which of the following letters represents this pocket, or whatever. Yes?
Can you explain again why it's S?
Because S is small and nonpolar, and so something that is large and nonpolar would be able to fit nicely next to a small and nonpolar fellow.
Okay.
Alright, so which of these guys was likely to be in position C? E, right? Because magnesium's gonna be there, so we need someone to stabilize or welcome that magnesium. If the magnesium wasn't there, which would it be?
K.
K, right? Yes, and it turns out there's a K like right here, in there. Alright, so, which fella, starts the whole reaction? And then, so, okay, I put it in the exam, this is the way I put it. Which of the following will have an increased affinity for protons upon substrate binding?
E.
Right, and so there's no letter there, right, but E, right? You guys all guess it would probably be E since I didn't put a letter there, right? So what do I mean by that? That means this aspartic acid, what happens when the substrate binds? This aspartic acid's like, oh no, I don't wanna be negative, why would I wanna be negative, right? So he's gonna take this fella, and if you guys recall, I'm not gonna draw on this because I always use this, right? The electrons are gonna go to, right, you gotta steal that proton, the electrons are gonna go here, now we have a nice nucleophile attacks off that phosphate. Let's see if we can do some true falses about hexokinase. Now that we did that, some of these are gonna be pretty straightforward. Alright, let's see. Hexokinase is a non-polar binding site.
Yes.
I know, I just gave that one away, right? Water is needed in hexokinase's mechanism. No, that's a big no, right? G6P can bind to hexokinase. True, right? It's a competitive inhibitor. We also call it a product inhibitor since it's actually the product of the reaction. Let's see. Delta G naught for hexokinase is a big negative number.
False.
Guess again. Remember, this guy is metabolically irreversible, right? Metabolically irreversible means that it's so spontaneous in the forward direction that metabolically, right, in these cells, we will never go backwards. Because we just discussed that when we did the ATP thing, right? The reactions are never a lot. It's minus 27, right? That's a lot, right? And depending on the availability of magnesium, there's a chance that we might not make anything on that reaction, right? We always have to have the reaction have a little bit of change at the end, right? Hexokinase is allosteric. True, right? All big three are. All the guys that are metabolically irreversible, right? ATP makes it slow, ADP, AMP makes it go, right? Hexokinase has an isozyme. What's its name? Glucokinase, yes. And hexokinase is found everywhere, including the liver.
True.
That is true, right? The liver has both hexokinase and glucokinase, right? Okay, let's see if we can Alright, so, let's see if we can do this exercise right here. So basically what we're gonna do is, when you're studying, these are things that you should do, right? So, I ask these questions in class, right? And so this is kind of what I'm talking about when I tell you all, you know, like try to make the answer the question, the answer. So this is the trajectory that I would go down if I was studying hexokinase, right? So the question that I posed, and I'll give you guys like 30 seconds to think about it. Why is water eliminated from the active site of hexokinase? I'm gonna give them 15 seconds. Then I'll take your answer.
I'm trying.
Alright, I'll take your answer, because you raised your hand first.
Because if you had water in the active site, it would correct the aspartic acid, and then the water would attack the phosphate, and it would hydrolyze, but the glucose wouldn't be.
That's true, so he said that water would hydrolyze the ATP, but glucose wouldn't get the phosphate, right? And so if we look at, that same fella, right? Oh, it's right here, on purpose, right? If we look at the same fella, right, so if water were there, and we drew this out the other thing, then aspartic acid still would be needy, and but take water's proton, creating a nucleophile of water would attack that phosphate, and then G6, or glucose would just be sitting here doing nothing, right? Alright, so then let's look at the next one. Then we could ask ourselves, okay, I get it, I understand why water is eliminated. So now let me go a little bit further. Water enters the active site of hexokinase, what are the products? ADP, inorganic phosphate, and glucose, right? Which is terrible, right? So we hydrolyzed an ATP and we didn't even put it somewhere, right? That's terrible, that would be awful. Alright, so now let's see if we can do a multiple choice question on it, right? So we'll go up a level. Well, if there's multiple answers, then you answer E. But I'm begging you guys to do this. Alright, I just gave it away, right? This is where you guys have the biggest issue with, right? So, what's your question? So I was just gonna say that. Right, so what is RQ? You guys tell me. Read the beeping question, right? RQ, read, or the, we say freaking, right? Read the freaking question, right? So what is the question? So the people that are there multiple answers, this is when you let the test take you and you don't take the test, right? So I'll give you another minute. I'm gonna tell you, the answer is not E. Right? I'm gonna tell you that off the boat. Alright, so what is the answer? C, right? So yeah, and so a lot of times when there's more than one of the above, I get a lot of students that say, oh boy, but you know, like I couldn't help it, like this is a true statement. Just because it's a true statement does not mean it's the answer. And this is test taking 101. There will always be a true statement as one of the answer choices. It's just the way it is, right? You're taking the MCAT, the DAT, the PCAT, what do you take for, you don't take anything for veterinary school? Well, GRE, of your PA, right? If you take any of those classes, or any of those exams, the multiple choice exam is always gonna have one true, or maybe two true statements, right? These two guys right here are studying for the MCAT, is that true, right? Yeah. Yes, exactly. So you gotta you don't hate the player, hate the game, right? You gotta get used to the game. All right, so the answer is indeed C, because this is the only thing that said, if water enters the active site of hexokinase, indeed hexokinase hydrolyzes ATP to ADP plus inorganic phosphate. Products that contain ADP, that's definitely false, so that's off the bat. Hexokinase has an enzyme called glucokinase, that is true, but does that answer the question? No. Hexokinase is subject to product inhibition, that is true, but does that answer the question? No. And so so for a lot of you guys who are like, oh, well, those two guys sound reasonable, right? And then you'll answer more than one of the above. The secret is that what you're supposed to do, right, is what you did here, right? These two questions I gave to you open, right? And so you were able to write down an answer. So just pretend that this question is open. And then take a piece of paper and cover it and write down the answer like you did for the other two. And then find that answer in the answer choices. Then move on to the next question. And then when you check and say, oh, that sounds reasonable, right? And so that's just the my advice I give you. What's up?
Okay, that's hilarious. I understand how you got C, which I also got, but my thing is, you said we should read the freaking question, but
Yeah.
3 of those answers are correct.
No, they're true statements, but they don't answer the question. Right, so if water enters the active site of hexokinase is subject to product inhibition? No, hexokinase is always subject to product inhibition. Does that make sense? All right, so now let's do something. I had fun when we did this the other day, right? So while we take our break, I'm gonna put up a V-Box. And let's see, just give me. Let me open her up. All right, then we'll do our 2-minute, 3-minute break right now, but there's a V-Box during it, because. Is it open? Oh, you gotta refresh, because I just opened it. Yeah.
Where do these points go? I don't know if they're
All right, so let me remind you guys, these points, right, so, I'm only allowed to give, what did I say, like 5% or whatever fraction? So, 7.5%, thank you, right? And so, I'm gonna keep doing them, and I'm gonna cap it, right? So I have that survey quiz, that bonus quiz, I'll put in another bonus quiz in a couple of weeks. At the end of the semester, we'll do another survey, right? And then in addition, these classes, and then you can earn so many points, I think it's like 50 or something, I'll cap it, or 75, whatever I said, I'll cap it, right? And then if you earn more, that's fine, right? So that means you can miss few, have a mulligan here and there, be sick 1 or 2 days, and still earn all the points. And they just go on top of your number, right? They just go on top of your number. So this is 2 points right here, so it's like getting almost a whole question back on your exam. All right, break time. Yeah.
And I love soccer. Do you want to see? She was calling up at Insta last night and she finally showed me her belly. She rolled over. Look at the baby. Oh. And this morning she was sitting on my lap. Look at the baby. Isn't she adorable? Look at the baby. And the baby. His stinks like he's stinky. The baby is being such a good girl. She finally groomed herself, and she ate and she drank. She's eating like a complete monster, which is great because I need her to gain weight because she's fucking teeny. It's one of those things. My mom Wait, can I try something? The pen that I bought isn't even working right. Can you try it with it isn't even Bluetooth, it should just write. It doesn't have Bluetooth. No, it should just write. Wait, try and find it on Bluetooth. Oh. Well, because I'm just confused.
No, hold on. I read that as like.
See, I'm just confused on why it's like. I'll go read the word because like adult, I'm on the Okay. I used a mask like you told me to. I feel like it looks less like I never brush my hair.
That's unfortunately how it's going.
When I was it says no.
Right.
But I guess like back in like 2020 when they were on James Corden. Yeah. And she was like don't speak, you're an American. That might be other thing. She hates that, not that. Alright.
This one is a lot than the last one, so there's that, right? I'm so back. I mean, there's some yucky ones in there, but tired is number one. Good.
Like Texas or Duke.
Yeah.
Where's mine?
Hexokinase, you do like hexokinase? I'm not really sure how that. Yeah.
I'm so confused. Wait, attach it to the magnet thing.
Maybe because
Wait, let me try and charge it. I haven't charged it yet, but it should work.
Alright.
After class, I'll try with you.
Okay, so let's get into it. We are on step 3 of glycolysis, right? So let's get into it, right? Alright, so we are now talking about the crown jewel of glycolysis, PFK, we're going to call it PFK1, right? That catalyzes the committing step. Right, and we remind ourselves the reason why it catalyzes the committing step. So let's just remind ourselves who the players are. We have our Alright, so we're just gonna remind ourselves of the reaction because I scanned that paper in the last class, and so I don't have it with me. Alright, so we have the committing step, and so this is our friend fructose 6-phosphate, this is our friend fructose 1,6-bis-phosphate, right? And why is this the committing step? It's a committing step because F616BP has nowhere to go other than the next reaction, which is our step 4, right? And in step 4, it's going to be turned into 2 3-carbon sugars. right? And we talked about this in the last class, and we'll get back to it after we, talk about all the fun things about, PFK, right? But we talked about this in the last class, and it has to do with the fact that, right, we know F6P can be turned back into G6P, which can be turned into glucose in the liver by severing off that phosphate, right? G6P could also be turned into a G1P intermediate into glycogen, and we don't worry about who those fellas are, because we'll talk about those in chapter 21 at the end of the show, right? And so that means that G6P has many fates and has a lot of things to do. And so when hexokinase does this, right, it's metabolically irreversible, but it's not the most regulated, it's not the committing step, because G6P has, we say, many fates. Remember, we say it has many fates. And the next time we do problems, that will come up, right? That's the next set of problems that we're gonna do next week. All right, so F6P has only one fate, and that fate is to be turned into 2,3 carbon sugars. And then we ended the last class talking about this, and then somebody told me that they just opened up their 401k, which made me happy, because then actually the analogy really worked, right? And so, if you recall, right, this right here, we say this is our ATM machine or our Apple Pay, right? So ATM machine I used to be able to use, but now we call it Apple Pay, right? So that means that you could just, that's the money that you have in your bank that you could just swipe and use, right? And, right, that's what that is. This right here is your 401k, right? So this is money that's put away for later, right? And that means that and if you want that, there's a little penalty. But what it really is, right, this is really glycogen, and what this really is stored as fats, right? And so that's a big commitment, right? So if we make our F16BP, we don't really want to store it as fat. We want to do the rest of glycolysis. I'll get your question in a second, right? We want to do the rest of glycolysis, and we want to make CO2 plus NADHs, right, and FADH2, so that we can make ATP, right, many ATP. So if we're going in this direction, it means that we're committing, we want this pathway. We don't really want this. It's not ideal. So we're gonna commit to do it. That's why we call it the committing step. We're gonna commit to the rest of the process. And there was a question, I saw a hand up, yes?
Yeah, are the 2,3 carbon sugars, are those the fats?
No, the 2,3 carbon sugars are, they're DAP, and we'll get to that after, right, and GAP. So glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, the dihydroxyacetone 3-phosphate, right, and then those are gonna be all turned into GAP, and then that GAP is gonna be turned into pyruvate, and then that is going to be taken into the citric acid cycle, right, if you recall, right, when we did the overview. Does that make sense? All right, so that's the reason why we call him the committing step. So obviously, if he's the committing step, he's gonna have tons of regulation and control, right? There's gonna be tons of ways, and we were pretty much saying, like we said in the last class, this guy is born in the T, right? He's born in the tight state. He's born with a wheelbarrow in the garage, right? Remember the T state? Wheelbarrow in the garage. You can put your car in there, but you have to displace the wheelbarrow. It's not ideal, but it could happen, right? Our state, garage is empty, just pull right in, right? So this guy is born with a permanent wheelbarrow in the garage, and then there has to be conditions in order to remove the wheelbarrow in the garage, right? Put it in the arm. And so let's talk about its control, right? So we'll make a list. I believe that's on the next page. Oh, no. I think I scanned in the page that had the list, so we'll just remake the list. All right, so let's see. PFK is allosteric. Right? Obviously, he's gonna be allosteric because of this, all this control that is necessary. And so it's gonna be, and then, like I said, it's, we're gonna say he's born in the T, right? So it comes off the, ribosome in the T state. All right, so there's going to be the usual suspects. Right, so those are our usual suspects, right? ATP, I just showed you, that's the end goal. And we're committing to making ATP if we want this molecule, if we have PFK work. Well, if there's ATP there, we might as well put it away in our ATM machine, right? Might as well put it away as glycogen. So ATP, and then remember we say slow, because when it's in the T, it still has activity, right? And you can even see that here, right, in this graph right here, right? So what we got going on here, we have PFK1 activity versus concentration of F6B, and then we have ATP, lots of it, ATP, a little of it, right? So ATP, if there's a little bit of ATP, works like a charm, right? Works just like a typical allosteric enzyme works. If there's a lot of ATP, it doesn't work. One thing that we discovered in our last class, right, in our last unit, towards the end, was that most enzymes do not have enough substrate to get the Vmax, right? Most enzymes don't have that luxury, right? Most enzymes are not operating at Vmax. Most of them are operating at, like, say, 1/10, 1/20th Vmax. So what if we were to say, look at this graph with that in mind, right? So we're just gonna look at it over here, right? So we're gonna look at it, I don't wanna muddy the waters by having too many graphs on there, right? And now remember, the black ink is a little bit ATP, the red ink is lots of ATP. So at the metabolic conditions of the cell, right, because F6P has a homeostasis amount, set baseline level that it should have. So at the amount of F6P that theoretically should be in the cell, it looks like with ATP works and without ATP doesn't work, right? So I would say this is probably 80% Vmax, right? And I would say that this is probably 15% Vmax, right? Which is why we were talking in terms of Vmax in the last chapter, right? So that we can understand that that's the way it works, right? Okay, so now let's look at another aspect of this, right? I just showed you the reaction. So ATP obviously binds to the active site of PFK, right? And ATP obviously binds to the allosteric site, which we also call the regulatory site of PFK. Which one do you think it binds to better? Guess again. The active site, right? Why would it bind to the active site better? Because we're basically, so let's take a step out, right? Remember, we're in the mitochondria. We all got this one right? So on the last thing, so we all understand ATP is sent out when ADP is sent in, right? So we got that down pat, right? And we also remember that in the cytoplasm, these are all the fellas that are for glycolysis, right? And so if ATP is being sent out, right, and there is a little bit of it, then it will tell PFK to go, and then go ahead, and then we will take our pyruvate into the mitochondria, we'll make some more NADHs so that those ADPs can be turned into, right, ATPs, right? That's the goal here. But if we do that, and these ADPs start turning more ATPs, and then there's a boatload of ATPs, do we need this process that I have in purple to keep happening? No, right? And so then we're just gonna be like, stop, 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 don't do it anymore, right? And then what will happen is this will be turned into G6P, and then this will be put away as glycogen, and then we can start this process again, and then those ATPs can float around and do all the other jobs that a cell has to do, like making new proteins, killing proteins, making new organelles, killing organelles, whatever the case may be, right? So it will bind, right, makes it slow, so it will bind to active site better. Consequently, this is not called product inhibition because ATP is an allosteric inhibitor, doesn't bind to the active site. To be a product inhibitor, you have to be a competitive inhibitor, just as an aside, if you were thinking that. Right, it binds to the active site better than the allosteric site. All right. So now let's talk about the other usual suspect. The other usual suspect is ADP, right? ADP is obviously, right, if there's a lot of ADP there. So let's say we're in the scenario where there's not a lot of ATP, there's a lot of ADP here. That ADP will be like, come on buddy, hurry up, because we need to do this path, right? We need to do that path right there, right? And so obviously ADP will be big on that. But PFK is unique the respect that it's very sensitive to AMP concentration. Right, so very, very sensitive to AMP concentration. And let's talk about the logic of that. In last Friday, we looked at a graph, right? And the graph said the concentration of ATP, ADP, and AMP when you're resting, and then after metabolic activity. And the one that had the most dramatic difference was AMP, right? Even though the AMP is such a little bit of what is around in the cell, it's not advantageous to take the second phosphate group off of ADP. But if we're in that pickle, we're in a pickle, right? If we're taking the second phosphate group, or we're turning into ADP and an AMP, then we're probably, in this timeline, we're probably like, why isn't this black line coming? Where is the oxygen? What's going on here? Why? And so then basically the ADP will be the creatine phosphate in the situation, right? We're like, what's going on here, right? And so that's not great. So that means that PFK has to do its job. PFK has to do this part, right? Because PFK is that committing step, and it's born in the T. So AMP is going to be very, very active in PFK. So let's look at that situation in this curve right here, right? So what are we looking at right here? Right, we're looking at, I'm sorry, it's a little blurry. It looks a little blurry. It doesn't look blurry to me, but on the screen it looks awful. Right, okay, so let's look at what we're looking at here. So the first line, no inhibitors, low ATP. Looks very similar to what we just saw up top, right? Looks very similar to that. The red line is 1 millimolar ATP, which we would call high ATP, and a teensy bit of AMP. Looks very similar to the curve that we saw up top, right? So that part we already hammered in, right? So we understand the black line and the red line are very similar. And in this one, they actually gave the demarcation line for me to show you, right? The, right, we can see, right, the, amount of F6P that will be in the cell, right? So we're again, 80% Vmax. This one looks like, in this particular case, this one looks like it's maybe at 40% Vmax. All right, so now let's look at the next one. The next one is just ATP, right? And so that one, with just ATP, right, we're at like 5% Vmax, right? Okay, so what is going on here? When we look at the red line, it looks like we got from 15% Vmax to 40% Vmax, and all we had was just a teensy little bit of AMP in there, right? Just a tiny little bit of AMP. So now, who do you think binds to the allosteric site better, ATP or AMP? AMP, right? Because we have a lot of ATP in both of these, and all we had is just, what, a smidge of AMP, right? 1/10 of the concentration of AMP. But it seems to make its way into that regulatory site better, and so regardless of the AMP concentration, it still gets our fella up to like 40% Vmax, right? And so 80% Vmax with just AMP, or there's not a lot of AMP, but with, if there's a lot of ATP, AMP can override it, right? So AMP can do a little bit of overriding here. And so that makes sense, because PFK needs to be very sensitive to AMP concentrations. And so that's what I mean when I say over here that it's very sensitive to AMP concentrations. And so we'll further say it binds to allosteric site better than anyone. So we'll just say ATP, right? All right. Okay, so we got those guys down. So now let's talk about some other ones that might not be so obvious, right? Actually, I'll put it over here on my list, right? So the other ones that might not be so obvious are our friend PEP and our friend citrate, right? And we're going to talk more about these towards the end. But PEP, phosphoenolpyruvate, this guy is made in step 9, right? And pretty much the way it's gonna work, and we'll go over this again when we're done, but we have the steps of the reactions that we already studied. So we'll write those guys out. Right, so that is the steps that we already studied, and then in blue I'll just put the steps that we're going to examine later, right? And we have this going on right here, and then we have Alright, so, again, we'll look at these in a little bit, right? So this is step 9, right, where PEP is made, and in step 10, PEP is used to do a substrate level phosphorylation, right? So we met PEP. Alright, let's think about the logic here when it comes to PEP, right? So, if we are in the situation where there's a lot of PEP, so there's a lot of me, right here, I'm just gonna choose this guy right here. There's a lot of that guy that I put a square around, right? Okay, so there's a lot of me right here. So do you think that we need to continue to let PFK do its job? No, right? So this will slow the enzyme down, right? And that makes sense, because pretty much what's gonna happen is, if we have a lot of this fella, that's a 3-carbon sugar, and what will end up happening is, it will not be taken into the, or will be taken into mitochondria, and it's gonna be turned into something we call acetyl-CoA, and the acetyl-CoA is how we assemble our fatty acids, and we'll see that later. So that's basically what I mean. So any excess 3-carbon sugar will be taken into mitochondria, turned into acetyl-CoA, and then just added to a long chain of carbons, and then put on the glycerol, and then sent to the adipose tissue, and we'll use you later, right? That's pretty much the fate of that fella. So this guy right here is gonna say slow, right? And so this is a sort of feedback. So we say we're giving you some feedback, and we're telling them to stop. So this is what we call feedback inhibition, which is probably a term that you guys have heard in other classes before, right? It's a common term, right? Not to be confused with product inhibition, right? Those two things are very different, right? So we talked about 3 different kinds of inhibition. Allosteric inhibition, right? Inhibitor puts it in T, right? Product inhibition, the product of the reaction acts as a competitive inhibitor. Feedback inhibition, a metabolite that's created later in the pathway inhibits an enzyme earlier in the pathway, right? So there are 3 different types of inhibition, so we gotta get them straight, yes?
I'm not gonna lie, I can't.
You can't see?
The
Oh, don't worry about these guys. Oh, the box?
The blue, like, right.
Oh yeah, don't worry about these guys. They're in the book. This is DAP, GAP, 1,3-PPG, 3PG, 2PG, pyruvate acid. Right, this is just the rest of glycolysis.
Okay.
Yeah, so we'll get through those guys. Yeah, that's why I wrote them really quick, and they are really sloppy, I apologize, right? But we'll say the rest of glycolysis. Right, that's what these guys are. And I put them in blue on purpose, because I was like, we didn't talk about those yet. Anybody else? Yeah.
So, does it competitively bind to the?
No, it's an allosteric. Yeah, it's an allosteric. And what was your question? I saw a hand in the back.
What is, can you define feedback inhibition again?
So feedback inhibition, let's write it down, right? So we'll write it on new paper. Right, so we have a nice clear definition. Feedback inhibition. Right, so we'll say a molecule, or we'll even say an intermediate, right? Created later in a pathway, inhibits an enzyme earlier, earlier. I appreciate the help, whoever just helped me, in the pathway. All right, also what we will find, a little bit of foreshadowing, is that we also have feed-forward activation, right? And so feed-forward activation would be when a molecule early in the pathway activates an enzyme later in the pathway. And it turns out that F16BP is a feed-forward activator, and he will activate the enzyme that catalyzes step 10. Because he'll basically say, I made 3-carbon sugars, right? 3-carbon sugars are being made because that's his only job. So you might as well make some pyruvate so we can turn it into acetyl-CoA and we can put it away, right? And so the pathway will communicate in both of those respects. All right, so citrate we'll get to later. Citrate is created in the citric acid cycle. And the citric acid cycle, we'll learn this later. This will basically be Wednesday after spring break, right? Is probably when we'll focus on this. But there are some molecules that have the rite of passage in and out of the mitochondria. Not everybody. Citrate's one of those lucky fellas that can transverse from outside the mitochondria and into the cytoplasm. So if we have citrate, which is created in the citric acid cycle, right? And citrate is supposed to basically be turned into CO2s and oxaloacetate. And if there's enough citrate, that citrate is floating outside of the mitochondria, it says, what are we doing here, right? We're fine. Why don't we stop? What are we doing here? Why are we making too much of these 3 carbon sugars? It's time to stop. And so this guy will also slow it down. And we will bring this back up again when we cover the citric acid cycle, right? The other thing that is actually interesting, this is a newer piece of information, right? Newer for me, right? For you guys before you were born, I'll get you in a second, is pH. So decrease pH. All right, so if we decrease the pH, right, we already talked about the overview, right? We know that when ATP is being made, there's a lot of H plus here, right? So that means we're decreasing the pH, right? So, because that's the same thing as saying more H plus. So if there is more H plus, what's going on here? That means that we are in a situation where, again, what are we doing here? Why do we need PFK to do its job, right? And so what decreased pH does, it actually makes ATP bind to allosteric site the best.
So it removes it from doing active sites instead?
So essentially what it does is it allows ATP to go to that allosteric site better than AMP, better than anybody else, right? And so better than its active site. So basically it just turns off PFK1, right? It just makes it completely shut down, not able to work. And then you had a question about the last thing?
Yeah, I just wanted to see, because I was reading through too. So is it that PEP is for F16BP and citrate is for F26BP?
Citrate is also for F26BP, and we're gonna get to that. Like, just hold your question until after I'm done. Right, so it's not for F26BP, it's for PFK1 in the liver and PFK2 in the liver.
Okay.
And PFK2 is the fellow who does it, but we're gonna get to that, like, that's where I'm going, and,
And it's more protons into the citrate, right?
yes, yes. And I'll put a little note here, PFK2, right, and so that way, it is, noted. Yeah.
So do photons leak out?
Yes, because they're tiny, right? And so they can diffuse out, right? If oxygen could diffuse in, a proton surely can diffuse out, right? Yes. And then also, the question was, do protons leak out? We know that protons leak out, right? Because if this is a big cell, what do these protons out here tell? They say hemoglobin. And then the oxygen makes its way in there, right? Right, so yes, of course they leak out because that's what we call an oxygen-starved tissue, right? All right, so let's talk about the liver. Coupling on the question from Ms. Muhammad. I don't know how to say her first name, so let's say it. It's Zara? Okay, all right, didn't want to say it wrong. I knew your last name though. All right, so let's talk about our friend, the liver, right, and what happens in there, right? So, as promised, right, the liver also has an isozyme of PFK, and again, all metabolically irreversible steps have a isozyme or have a different setup, right? And as I said, PFK1 in the liver, that's where citrate is really important. It does happen in other cells, right? But we will, again, we'll get to that a little bit later. All right, so in the liver, the only way that the PFK in the liver will work will only work with a fella called F26BP. Right, so let's draw our F26BP. I'll draw him right here. Right, I drew F16BP on purpose, right? And so that way we can remind ourselves what each looks like. So I'll draw right, so I drew my Theranos ring, right? I numbered my carbons, right? I didn't number them. Right, I numbered my carbons, and so F26BP would have a phosphate group on carbon 2, not carbon 1, right? And so the way it works in the liver is that we have to make this fella F26BP to tell the liver PFK1 to go, right? So that means it's an allosteric activator. Right, so he's an allosteric activator. Right, so let's first look at the graphs here, and then we'll talk about how PFK1 is made. Right, so all right, so let's look at these two graphs that I have here. So this is rate on this corner, and then concentration of F6P, right? And then this is rate, concentration of ATP, right? So we're looking at two different graphs here. So let's focus on the first one. All right, so this is PFK activity, and we're increasing the concentration of F6P, and we're looking at the concentration of F26BP. Right, so the top one has 1 micromolar, so a lot of F26BP. The second one has a little bit less of F26BP, and the third one has no F26BP, right? And so remember, we're pretty much here when we're in the cell, so now let's look at it in that respect. So lots of F26BP, we're at Vmax. A little bit of F26BP, we're at 80% Vmax. And no F26BP, 20% Vmax. Right, that's why I say slow, right? That's why I say slow. We're not completely done. It still has 20% activity, right? But that's measly, right? Okay. Now let's look at it in terms of ATP, right? So we know the more ATP there is in PFK, the more ATP that will bind to the regulatory / our allosteric site that will make it stop. So if we look at this curve right here, all of them go down, right? All of them end up going down. And the reason why they go down is because the more ATP we have, the less activity we have, because ATP will then end up making its way to the regulatory site, right? And so F26BP, it will work only for a little bit, then ATP will basically turn it off. This guy will still get to 80% Vmax, and then ATP will turn it off, right? And then this guy right here will get to 60% Vmax, right? So it will actually do its job because ATP is binding to its active site, but then pretty quickly it will be turned off, right? And so it turns out that ATP does still kind of run the show, right? ATP will allow it to work, but just for a tiny bit of time, right? And so if we look at this guy right here we're not looking at ATP, right? We have a little bit of Vmax, 80%, 100%. If we look at this one right here, right, with that same concentration, ATP can kind of sort of override the F26BP. Right, that makes sense, because if there's a lot of ATP, a little bit of ATP, it probably means that we need to make more, right? So it makes sense. So the liver does have some ability to control its metabolism. All right, so so we're just gonna draw out really quick before we, in the last 3 minutes of class, right? So we have F6P, F26BP, right? This fella right here that catalyzes this reaction, we call this PFK2, right? How do I discern between PFK1 and PFK2? PFK1 does F6P to F16BP, right? And this is the PFK that we know and love, right? But the liver has the isozyme PFK2. Right, oh, sorry, right? Then if we wanna go in reverse, right, it's a phosphatase, right? And so this will be called fructose 2,6-bis phosphatase. Or F, right, or fructose bisphosphatase 2, right, usually abbreviated that way. And then the liver also, so the liver has this isozyme, so in the liver, we'll keep track over here, right, it has PFK1 like everyone else, right, it has PFK2, and has fructose bisphosphatase 2, right, and it also has fructose bisphosphatase 1. And what do we suppose that guy does? Exactly, right? Oops, I didn't hydrolyze off the phosphate in the first one. All right, so why is this all relevant? Right, so why is this all relevant? So in the liver, we have F6P that's made, G6P gets turned into F6P, right? Glucose gets turned into G6P, right? F6P is made, and now this step is stopped, right? We're done, we're stopped. The liver's like, oh, but you know, you could go ahead and do it. So actually what's gonna happen is the F6P is gonna be turned into F26BP, and then that F26BP will say, okay, you can go and do your job, right? And that's pretty much what's gonna end up happening. And then what happens is there's not a lot of glucose in the blood, and the liver's not allowed to do it. And so what's gonna happen is then we're going to have our F26BP taken away. This guy will not be able to do its job. And then this will go in this direction. We can hydrolyze off that phosphate in this direction and send glucose out the cell, right? And so we will pick up on this on Friday, right? We'll start here on Friday.